So when I say I'm happy to be here tonight, I really am happy to be here. So the book that I ended up writing has all sorts of interesting anecdotes and stories about standing up to Putin, about our investigation into the money laundering connected to Sergei Magnitsky, and into the and how we went about passing Magnitsky Acts, which now exist in 34 countries. But the punchline of the book, and this is spoiler alert, but I can still say this and you'll enjoy the book, is that what we concluded from this investigation that we did was that Vladimir Putin and his cronies over a 22-year period have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state. That's $1,000 billion. And this is not pie in the sky stuff. This is the result of 10 years of forensic investigation into money laundering connected to the Kremlin. Now, $1 trillion is a lot of money, and it's money that should have been spent on hospitals, schools, roads, public services of all different kinds. And instead, it was spent on yachts, private planes, villas, private schools, and all the crazy things that we see a very small number of Russians doing here and in the United States and in the south of France and various other places. And in my opinion, the entire crisis that we're in the middle of right now, it comes back to this corruption and this $1 trillion. Vladimir Putin understood that you can only do this kind of stealing for so long before people get mad. Russia is supposed to be a democracy. People believe that they have a right to vote. And after a certain period of time, if 1,000 people steal everything and 140 million people live in destitute poverty, eventually those people are going to break one day and rise up. We don't know when it's going to happen, or we don't know how it's going to happen, but eventually those people will do that. And it's not a crazy thing to say that that could happen. The exact same thing happened in Kazakhstan in January of this year. Nursultan Nazarbayev had been the dictator of Kazakhstan since the former Soviet Union dissolved. And in January of this year, and by the way, he stole more money per capita than Putin has stolen from the Russian people. And in January this year, out of nowhere, they raised the price of gas, and the people in Kazakhstan sort of simultaneously erupted in all cities across Kazakhstan and threw him out and threw his family out and will ask for all the money back and all the other terrible things that will come along with it. And the same thing happened in Egypt and Tunisia and many other places. And Putin understood that he may be a hard man, he may be a dictator, but things could really go badly wrong for him in a split second. And so what does he do? He does what every dictator does when they're afraid of losing power. He started a war. And I believe, and this will go against what Fiona Hill said a few weeks ago, but I believe that there's nothing ideological about Putin's war in Ukraine. It doesn't matter what he said in speeches and in essays. That's all for public consumption. The reason for this war is very simple. Putin is a grubby little man who's stolen an enormous amount of money and is desperately afraid of the people of Russia rising up against him. And by the way, his entire presidency is predicated on war. When he came to power, he wasn't sure whether he'd actually be elected in a fair election. At that time, they had fair elections. And what did he do? He put together a bunch of apartment bombs around Russia, in Moscow and various other places, blamed it on the Chechens, and then after that started a war where he killed tens of thousands of Chechens. And after that, he was elected. And so when we look at this whole situation and we say, would he do that? Yes, he would. He started a war in Chechnya to get elected. He started a war in Georgia when his approval ratings were flagging and his approval ratings went way up. Taking Crimea, same thing happened. And now this is what happened. And so when we look at this whole thing, we have to say to ourselves, there's all this talk about off-ramps and negotiations and peace treaties. But knowing what I know about Putin, the whole purpose of being at war is to be at war. And so it's not like if we give him some commitment that Ukraine won't join NATO, that he will agree and compromise and have peace, because the whole point of being at war is to be at war. And so when we look at this whole situation, there's really only three outcomes. Either we win, and when I say we win, the Ukrainians win decisively and kick the Russians out of Ukraine, or the Russians win, Putin wins. I don't know how that happens, but if Putin wins, then what will happen next is he'll line up on the Estonian border or the Polish border or some other border, because for him, this is not about any specific objective, it's about being in conflict. And if he does that, then we've got a much bigger problem than we have right now. And so ideally, we have to do everything possible to help the Ukrainians win, which means more military support, it means more sanctions, and cutting him off entirely from all the money that he has flowing from the West. The third option, which I'm afraid is probably the most likely option in this whole scenario, is that neither of the two options happen. Neither the Ukrainians win nor the Russians win. And that's the most likely scenario. And I put that scenario at a 70% probability. And so, and for what it's worth, I don't believe that this war started on February 24th. I think that this war started 2014. Everybody, there was this crazy thing where we have described the invasion of eastern Ukraine by Russian-backed separatists, and the BBC uses this terminology, and CNN uses this terminology, and because of this terminology, we've somehow sort of said, well, we don't have to do anything about this, and because of that, we've basically allowed Putin for 8 years to be at war with Ukraine without any serious consequences. Now, the other thing which I want to say is that there's a lot of people that say, well, if we had not, we provoked him. The expansion of NATO provoked Putin into doing this. And I do think we have some responsibility for what happened, but it has nothing to do with NATO. Putin is 95% responsible for this whole thing. But we are 5% responsible for one simple reason, which is that over the last 22 years, we've allowed him to do this. We've allowed Putin to get away with it. We've not done anything in response to Georgia. The invasion of Georgia, President Obama said both sides should show restraint. After the taking of Crimea, we applied sanctions to a bunch of Eastern Ukrainian separatist leaders, no oligarchs. After the bombing of civilians in Syria, nothing. After Salisbury, various thousands and tens of thousands of British people went to the World Cup. And so to the extent that we have some responsibility, it was for giving Putin the sense that that he wouldn't be facing any serious consequences this time around either. And so going forward, since this isn't a political fundraiser, we have to have a strong backbone to deal with Putin. And there's nobody I know who's got a stronger backbone than Ed Lucas. And as Ed said, we were the lone voices in the wilderness for a very long time. And everybody thought that we had some type of issue yeah, you're probably right about some of these things, but you've got some kind of like emotional issue or something like that. And now all of a sudden, he and I are like the only two guys who are right about this whole thing from the last 20 years. I can't think of a better person to represent us in Parliament than Ed Lucas, and we should give our money, our time, and anything else we can give to support Ed, because even though there's hundreds of members of Parliament, I guarantee you that if this man were in Parliament, he would make a huge and noticeable difference. So I'm glad to be here. I'm happy to answer questions, and most importantly, to support you in this hopefully successful campaign for Parliament. Thank you.
Well, Bill, thanks very much indeed for that touching, that really moving endorsement. And I want to just ask you a couple of questions to start off with, and then we've got a roving microphone which will go, and you'll be able to ask Bill questions yourself. But one of the things that strikes me about this is there's been remarkably little introspection in the West about our own weaknesses. We kind of suddenly realize that we're very dependent on Russian gas if we're Germany. We realize perhaps we didn't spend enough money on defense if we're Germany. We realize that we're a bit vulnerable to Russian propaganda if we're Germany. But leaving the Germans aside, there's been a sort of bit of a wake up, but not nearly enough, I think, attention to all the different cracks and flaws and weaknesses in our system that Russia's been exploiting for at least the past 20 years, and I would argue even before then. Some of you will know that I was the first witness to the Intelligence and Security Committee inquiry into Russia in 2018, and under both the protection of official secrecy and parliamentary privilege, I felt I could say what I really think, which is what I can't say here because Schillings and Carter Ruck are watching. And it was the thing that made me go into politics, was the sight of that report, first of all, being delayed by Boris Johnson, then his attempt to nobble the committee so it would never come out. And then when it finally did come out, the fact that he didn't act on it, and still to this day hasn't. And so there's a real tension between this really quite almost sort of bombastic approach on the military side, where you have Ben Wallace and Liz Truss rivaling each other with ever more exotic war aims. I think one of them is going to say, we'll not just liberate Ukraine, we're going to liberate Russia next as well. And it's all fantastic. I mean, obviously, I love it. But there's such a contrast between that and the failure to get to grips with so much that's happening here. So, Bill, I want to just talk us through some of the things, not just in this country, but in other countries that have been hurled at you in the years since you first started this. You've told us about Trump, and that was perhaps a particular high point or low point, but you've had exciting adventures here in the law courts. There's been stuff in Switzerland and elsewhere. So talk us through a couple of those episodes, and then maybe we can draw some conclusions from them.
So Russia is a nonpartisan briber of politicians, officials, and other characters. They will spend money. They basically offer everybody an opportunity to corrupt themselves, and some people say yes, and it's remarkable. There was a Swiss officer in the Swiss Federal Police, who's the most senior Russian-speaking officer. He was assigned to investigate the money laundering complaint that we filed in Switzerland, which was connected to the money that Sergei Magnitsky was murdered over. They found the money, they froze it, and then he started going to Russia, and they would invite him on bear hunting trips. And bear hunting trips that were paid for by oligarchs. And he went to Kamchatka. He flew from Moscow to Kamchatka, and then they picked him up on a helicopter and took him into the mountains and shot bears for several days. And he went boar hunting in Yaroslav, and we don't know, of course, what cash they may have provided him with, but all these bear hunting trips and so on was all well documented. And on these trips, they would tell him how to scupper the Magnitsky investigation. And he came back and he scuppered it. And so 10 years later, after supposedly investigating this money, the money which came from the Russian tax office, the lady who organized the tax refund, the $230 million tax refund that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over, her husband got $11 million of that at Credit Suisse in Zurich, and we could trace all the money from Russia to him. And they somehow couldn't find the link. And so they're returning the money. And why are they returning the money? Because they had a corrupt guy working on the investigation. And when we challenged the Swiss, and I've been really beating hard on the Swiss in the last few days. In fact, we got a hearing in Congress on this at the U.S. Helsinki Commission. The Swiss foreign minister called up Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, not to apologize about this or anything like that, but to complain that the hearing was taking place. And so the rot is just incredible, and that's just one example. That's Switzerland. You know, we have here at the National Crime Agency.
So just so we to be on the safe side, this Swiss politician, this official, was he actually convicted?
Yeah, he was convicted in court.
He's convicted in court, so we can actually say he's corrupt.
He took bribes and he was convicted in court.
Yes.
And so his lawyers can't sue us. So I know you're worried about that. He was convicted.
Yeah. And tell us about, you also sued for libel here in London, and that was a pretty spectacular case as well.
The way that the whole Magnitsky, the crime that Sergei Magnitsky exposed worked was that my offices were raided by the Moscow police. They seized all of our documents, and then the documents were used to steal our companies and then steal $230 million of taxes. The person who had custody of the documents was a Major Pavel Karpov of the Moscow Interior Ministry. And it was just so ridiculous. He had custody of the documents. We could prove he had custody of the documents. We could prove the documents were used in a $230 million fraud. And by the way, I couldn't get many journalists to write about it because of this whole libel thing. So we decided that we'd make a little YouTube story about it. And so I made a 10-minute YouTube story about it, and he got really angry. And the YouTube thing went viral. Everybody loved it. It was, and in fact, if you're interested, it's still on YouTube. It's called Russian Untouchables, Major Pavel Karpov, and have a read. I mean, not a read, a listen. It's fun. Anyway, so all of a sudden, like a couple of days before the 1-year anniversary when the YouTube was launched, a big package comes from the law firm Olswang, which is now CMS, from a Geraldine Proudler, who is a partner in reputation management at CMS. And the document was a thick libel suit written by, I'm afraid to say this, Andrew Caldecott QC, the guy who defended you in your case, who charges, I think, £1,000 an hour, and she charges like £600 an hour. And so they had been hired by Major Pavel Karpov, who had been on a salary of something like $15,000 a year to sue me for libel. And this case went on for like a year and a half. We ran into like £1.5 million of legal fees, and we hadn't even gotten to court yet. This was just all the pre-trial action stuff. And we eventually got the case kicked out as an abusive process after £1.5 million of legal fees. And the loser pays when this thing happens. And he had some money on deposit, some money we ended up having to eat ourselves, and we were awarded £600,000 that Pavel Karpov had to pay us in legal fees. And the day when that judgment came through, he fired Olswang and then disappeared into the ether, and never to pay us the money. Now, of course, Olswang got their full fees, as did Andrew Caldecott QC, but we were left £600,000 out. And thankfully, there's like a tiny little piece of justice in the whole thing, which is that there's now an arrest warrant for Pavel Karpov if he ever enters the UK. So I take a little bit of pleasure from that. But the idea that a Russian policeman can come here to this country and sue a human rights activist and have to spend this kind of money. And I can afford it, but most other people can't. And I get emails and letters and stories about this all the time from journalists in all sorts of places who have tried to expose corruption. And they say that this whole libel thing has been reformed, and it's like nowhere near reformed. I mean, the fact that this is just the worst place in the world for that. And so hopefully when you go to Parliament, this will be one of your hallmark issues, and you can actually make something happen on this thing.
And what is so frustrating about this is that I used to, when I was at The Economist, one of my jobs was sort of trying to train the other journalists in libel, and I used to produce a fake article every year or so, which about made up people and made up countries, and we'd have a competition to see how many libels you could find within the article, and the winner got a bottle of champagne. So I followed this quite closely, and we really thought we'd won when the libel law was reformed, that we had a defence of, if you reasonably believe it to be true, that if you're a journalist or someone else respectable, you were basically safe, and that was chipped away quite quickly, and it's fantastically expensive. Luckily, when I was at The Economist, we were insured for libel, which is in itself expensive, and the insurers would pick up a bill of £500,000 or something, which wasn't a big deal for them. Actually, it was quite good advertising. They could say that it proves that you get your money's worth with libel insurance. But this is a different world from the world that most people live in. If you're Economist, FT, Sunday Times, those sort of papers will take those sort of risks. But most people just say, better not write about it. And so there's a vast amount going on under our noses in this country, which people like you will never find about because people like me are too scared of libel to write about it. And I'm really glad we've got our colleagues here who are sitting here in the front row who are campaigning on this. There's an awful lot to do to deal with these strategic lawsuits against public participation. And we have an idea, Bill, which I just want to bounce off you, which I think we should create no-fly zones for these enablers. I think that the Congress of the United States could quite easily say to the State Department that if you're involved in suppressing free speech in the EU or in the UK, you can't come to the United States anymore. And we could say that about the Americans who do this and to the Europeans, and the Europeans could say that about the Brits and the Americans. And suddenly these people would find that their lives were rather more complicated. And you've been very kind, Bill, to endorse this idea, but I wonder if could you explain a bit more how it might work?
Well, I mean, so I think we were discussing this. Ed had me over for dinner maybe a month ago or 6 weeks ago, and he came up with the idea, and I thought, yeah, of course, that makes such sense. And so I was actually invited to give evidence at there was a hearing in Congress on the enablers of oligarchs, and this is not an issue that has gone unnoticed anywhere, and particularly after the Catherine Belton lawsuit. And for those of you who don't know, Catherine Belton, she's another friend of ours who wrote a book called Putin's People, where she really she spent 8 years researching it, and it's the most damning document you could ever see on Putin's corruption. And literally 364 days after it was published, 4 oligarchs simultaneously sued her in libel court here.
And not just her publishers, but they sued her personally as well.
Roman Abramovich, Mikhail Friedman and Peter Oven, Rosneft, and 1 or 2 others. And they said, oh, we have nothing to do with each other. This is all just, we all decided 364 days after the book was published to all just hire independent lawyers. And when 1 QC, by the way, was working for all of them. But it was not coordinated. It was not ordered or anything like that. And it was like the most disgusting legal pylon I've ever seen, and I think everyone else had the same reaction. I mean, it was truly the David versus Goliath fight, and so awful. And that was the reason that they organized this hearing. And anyway, so I go to Washington, and I just had dinner with Ed, and I said, "Can you ban the visas of the people who do all this nasty stuff shutting down journalists and whistleblowers and human rights activists. And so the co-head of the Helsinki Commission wrote a letter to the Secretary of State saying, here's a list of lawyers who are up to this stuff, including Geraldine Browder, the one who did my thing. And I can imagine that she had a pretty bad day when she woke up and saw that her name in the Daily Mail being talked about having her visa canceled to the United States.
And the great thing, and we want to go to the questions to the floor now, but the great thing about this, these people have done absolutely nothing wrong, and I stress that because they're probably watching. They're not accused of any wrongdoing.
Well, no, they've done absolutely everything wrong by trying to shut up free speech. Everything wrong.
But the thing about the visa, it's a smell test. There's no human right to a visa. You can't sue your way to a visa. And if the United States decides that you can't come, it's like Rick says in Casablanca, your cash is good at the bar. And what I love about this tactic is even before anything's actually happened, it's already moved the needle. It's already said there is the climate of total impunity is over. So if you're a banker, if you're a lawyer, if you're an accountant, if you're a PR person, if you're any one of these fixers and grifters and other people who've been riding the caviar express, business class, such enormously lucrative way over the last 25 years, well, that doesn't come free anymore because we, Bill and I and others, are already working on things that are going to make your life very difficult. And there won't be anything you can do about it because you won't be able to sue us and you won't be able to sue the governments that don't give you visas. And what I love about this is it shows that even before we've actually got to the general election, we're already beginning to make a difference. We're already changing the weather just a little bit, and there's a lot more of this to come. So on that note, let's have some questions from the audience. We have a roving microphone. This is Alexander, who's just come back from the Ukrainian-Polish border, where he's been interpreting for refugees. A round of applause for Alexander. And I would just like to say it's fantastic seeing so many Ukrainians in the audience. You're what we're fighting for. Okay, questions, come on. And if you could identify yourself, it's Ewan Grant.
Yeah, Ewan Grant, former law enforcement intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet states. I've known Bill and particularly Edward for many years. Some of the people who've had a go at me, and they're not all Russians, are precisely the same people who've had a go at both of them. My question is, citing Tom Clancy's famous phrase that he always used to use in so many of his books, there's no substitute for looking someone in the eye. Do the lawyers or the barristers who've initiated the cases, do they look you in the eye? And what do you see in their eyes? Thank you.
You go first, Bill.
Well, actually, I bumped into Andrew Caldecott at Catherine Belton's victory party because she was also defending him. So she's been twice on the good side, once on the bad side. And I think he had a hard time looking me in the eye. I think it was not a pleasant experience for him. And his excuse was it's the cab rank principle of you take whatever clients show up on the barrister side. But I think that that's just not true because there's many barristers that I approached that didn't want to work for me. And you can easily say you're too busy if you don't want to work for somebody. There's many ways of going. And on the solicitor side, I can say this. I approached Schillings to work for me when I was being harassed by the Kremlin, who were trying to put out all sorts of lies and misinformation about Sergei Magnitsky's death and about me. And of course, they wouldn't touch me with a barge pole because that would mess up their Russian business. And I've had many lawyers in all different aspects of life who wouldn't work for me because they didn't want to upset the gravy train. And so there's no truth to that at all. And I'm sure that Geraldine Browder, she's having a hard time looking anyone in the eye now. She had to resign from her position at Middlesex University. She resigned from her position I think she was on the board of the UK Pen, I believe. And can you believe, I mean, you know what UK Pen is? It's a free speech organization. She was suing me for libel. She was on the board of The Guardian. I think she's having a hard time looking a lot of people in the eye now.
There's one other particular point here, that it's part of the legal system that you should know where your client, who your client is, and where their money comes from. And it's very odd to me that you could come as a Moscow policeman and take a very expensive. If I went to a law firm, which I've had to do on occasion, and say, I've got this legal issue, would you like to represent me? Almost before I've finished my sentence, they're saying, we'll need £15,000, please, just to be going on with. And this is, and it's no joke. So the idea that they would, that you can represent people where the money is people who are unable to go to the United States, for example, because they're what are euphemistically called robust business practices have come to the attention of the FBI. And this is literally a thing. I can't mention his name here, but there is a very well-known Russian who cannot go to the United States because
Oleg Deripaska.
So I can now no longer complete the sentence because I'm sure the person I was going to refer to may be watching right now. You see what kind of maze of mirrors we're in. Let's have some more questions. Who's got another?
Hi, I'm Lambertus. I'm from Wimbledon, whatever, or originally South Africa. I grew up with sanctions. Apartheid South Africa, whatever, it cost us 2 World Cups, but it worked. I think it worked. I mean, the impact it had on me as a child, I didn't have Barclays, I didn't have Disney and all of that. I currently work for quite a large bank. Most of you will know it, that are still operating in Moscow. Now, I've had a bit of a fight with them. Why are we still there? We employ 200 people, we've got about a turnover of 15 million. I'd be interested to know what's your view on that. Do you think there'll be is there any benefit in closing down the business, the Russian business? Or do we say, well, they're serving local, international clients and they keep on going? I think that's my question.
Bill, you go first, and I may have a slightly different view from you.
After Sergei Magnitsky was killed, about a couple months afterwards, I went to South Africa, and because I have a small place in Cape Town, and I brought with me all sorts of human rights movies to watch, and see if I could get some inspiration on what to do. And one of the movies was Cry Freedom, which was about the terrible story and plight of Steve Biko, who was anti-apartheid activist who was murdered by the South African police, and they covered up the murder. It's a very similar story to Sergei Magnitsky. And after I was done watching it, I was really fascinated and kind of obsessed with all the characters involved. And the main character was a writer for the Daily Mail of South Africa who he had passed away from cancer. And so I kept on researching, and I found another person who was sort of equally important. It wasn't in the movie, but equally important in the whole story, which was a woman named Helen Zille, who was also a journalist at the time and had to go into hiding and do all sorts of stuff to expose the Steve Biko story. And I wrote. And at the time, she had risen in the ranks and had become after apartheid was over, she had become the governor of the Cape region of South Africa. And I wrote her, I wrote a handwritten note and faxed it to her office in the hopes of meeting her. I was going to only be in South Africa for another 2 days. And it was kind of a, 1,000 to 1 shot, but she read my note, and it was all about Sergei Magnitsky. And she called up the next morning and she said, I've canceled all my plans. Can I see you? And I said, of course, yes, that's the whole point. And so she came to my house and spent the whole morning with me, and we talked about everything about Sergei Magnitsky, and she told me that it was sanctions that ended apartheid, and the most important thing that could have happened was the West stopping disinvestment and sanctions, and that stayed with me, and that was the seed that ended up becoming the Magnitsky Act. And it's certainly, if I look at what's going on right now, it's the right thing to be doing for every company to be pulling out of Russia and any company that comes up with an excuse, it's just an excuse. There's reasons why you could be there for the employees, for this, for that, but ultimately, it's a sign of solidarity. You know, whatever hardship the Russians might endure from a company pulling out is nothing compared to the hardship that the Ukrainians are enduring with bombs dropping on and killing them on a daily basis. And I think it's anyone who continues to do business in Russia is like the companies that did business in Nazi Germany, and there were companies that did that, and those companies should not do business in Russia. And most companies have pulled out, and it's been remarkable that at enormous cost they pulled out. And so those who don't pull out should pull out.
Can I? Yeah.
Yeah, let me just say one word about that because it's really important. So South Africa is one of the neutral countries on this situation, and in fact, well, maybe not even neutral. I think that they're supporting Russia, and I find that to be unbelievably offensive that the West has stood up for the oppressed people of South Africa. The government, the current government, the ANC government, the West stood up for them with these sanctions, which weren't easy to put in place. And now when South Africa is turning its back on the West, and I think that that's really unpleasant and horrible and won't be forgotten.
I think you've touched, there's two huge things here which we could spend all evening discussing, and thank you for raising them. I think one is that there's a perception in much of the world that this is an East-West struggle, and that the West has got a proxy called Ukraine, and the proxy is getting a kicking, and that means the West is getting a kicking. So it's a bit like Afghanistan. And if you read the South African, Indian, Brazilian, large slice of the what one might call the global South, that's the way it's framed. And I've been arguing, both when I get invited on programs in these countries, but also urging the Ukrainians to make the point that this should be portrayed as an anti-colonial struggle. This is the former colonial power, the former imperial power, motivated by an absolutely naked neo-imperialist ambition, operating basically an old-fashioned colonial land grab. And if one frames it that way, then it's easier to get, I think, might be easier to get support. On sanctions, my worry is that we think sanctions are the easy option. And before this happened, it was very common to hear people say, if Russia ever tried anything, we just kick them out of SWIFT. And then the Russian economy collapses overnight and the problem will be solved. And we placed a huge faith in our ability to use economic coercion to get political change. And I'm afraid that faith was misplaced because Putin doesn't have the same priorities as we do. He doesn't mind if Russian GDP falls 10, 15%. We see from Zimbabwe, from Cuba, from Iran, from many other countries that if you have a sufficiently tyrannical leadership, sufficiently self-interested, they will put up with the immiseration of their country. They may even weaponize the immiseration of the country and say this shows that the outside world is out to get us. Now, I'm not against sanctions, but I'm particularly keen that we should concentrate on the sort of sanctions that will make the most difference. And what I've been suggesting, and I think Bill is as well, is we implement the Navalny list. The Navalny list of the top, what's it, 30, there's about 30 people on that. There's another list he's put up with 5,000 people on that. And we say to them, not just you, no more visas and all your assets are frozen, but your siblings and your spouses and your offspring and your parents and your in-laws. Now that's a blunt instrument, there will be some casualties of that, but that would really hurt, because a lot of these people don't come to the West much, but their families do. They have mistresses, so mainly men, mistresses in London. Their children go to my alma mater, LSE, or other lesser establishments. They come here for their dentistry, their own mansions in this constituency through offshore vehicles, which we're also going to deal with. But I think that means that they can't enjoy the fruits of the West would be a gut punch to the Russian elite, and would be, I think, more effective than saying, you can't, we're not going to sell you toothpaste anymore. Let's have some more questions. And can I say, if there's anyone here from Russia or from Ukraine who'd like to ask a question, that would be particularly welcome. The lady here in the front, middle row, can we have the microphone right here?
Good evening. I'm a Ukrainian lawyer. I live in London here for nearly 20 years. I'm working in commercial litigation around the world. My question is that when Boris Johnson's government added some people, put some Russian oligarchs on a sanctioned list, some of them are still untouchable, like Mr. Potanin or German Khan, who is a very close partner to Michael Friedman or Peter Avan. So what is your opinion on this? How Boris Johnson or his government actually putting people on a sanctioned list? How do they select them? On what terms? Thank you.
Bill, they don't select them with sufficient, not with sufficient vigor would be my answer.
So, so I've spent 10 years thinking about who should be sanctioned. But they've only spent like 3 months thinking about it, and they weren't listening to me and Ed as we were briefing them and talking to them and cajoling them for 10 years. And so they're kind of starting from a point of little information, and they are. I actually I never compliment government here. I'm constantly criticizing them, but I think that they've actually done a pretty good job so far. And I would say that only 35. So there's 118 people on the Forbes rich list. And by the way, to be rich in Russia, you can only be rich at the permission and pleasure of Vladimir Putin. And to have that permission, you have to basically hold money for him, 50%, and you have to do financial services for him, pay for things when instructed. And so with 1 or 2 or 3 exceptions, everybody who's an oligarch in Russia should be sanctioned. The fact that we've gone after, there's some really high value targets that we've gotten here. Abramovich and Deripaska and Michael Friedman, and these are all very high value targets, but you're right, there are a bunch of people that haven't been sanctioned. And so I would say that we need to get from 35 to 118. How do we do that? What's the logic? I think it's just every new atrocity attracts new desire to sanction more people and to announce more sanctions. The other problem I should point out is that if you look at those 35, when I say 35, they're not sanctioned by the UK. There's 35 people sanctioned by either the UK, the US, Canada, or the EU, or Australia. And what's interesting is that Abramovich is sanctioned here and in the EU and not in America. A bunch of, for a while, Deripaska was sanctioned in America and not the UK. And I have to go through my list, but they're all different. It's like a mix and a match. And there should be some type of harmonization of these sanctions lists, so these people can't go anywhere and can't do anything with all this stuff. And as Ed said, you can't just go after the principal, because just as much as these people are holding money for Putin, there are people holding money for them. Sometimes it's family members, and sometimes it's close associates. And it's very interesting to watch that, like, all of a sudden, Abramovich, all of the guys around him became big owners of stuff really quickly. And the UK did the right thing, and they sanctioned those individuals.
Or American lawyers who abuse the attorney-client privilege to hold money for clients. I think there's another point here, which is that we are fantastically bad at doing financial intelligence on these sort of issues. We have gimmicky names like the new anti-kleptocracy unit, but the people there who are admirably conscientious, it's not Swiss-style corruption. Gosh, I love saying Swiss-style corruption. They're underpaid, they're under-resourced, they're terrified of incurring legal bills. The other side lawyer up immediately if anything happens, and so you get people really, I think the SF, the Serious Fraud Office, realized that one case they're going to take on would be 1/3 of their entire litigation budget if they went down that road, so that they're quite risk averse. And we haven't managed to integrate our intelligence system with financial enforcement. The odd thing about this, and I've talked to the American government about this, and they absolutely get this, they just haven't fully implemented it, is that when it comes to terrorist finance, we're really good. So if somewhere in the Balkans, take some random place. There's some terrorist finance going on. Some local jihadists are doing some hawala transfers. You instantly get the attention of the American intelligence community and of the criminal justice system and of everybody else. And they will jump on those people and they will make sure it doesn't happen anymore. If you say this is weaponized corruption going on, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party or the Kremlin, it all sounds very complicated and it's really hard to get attention. So we need to say that this weaponized corruption being used to buy influence in our country needs to be treated like terrorist finance. And that would require a revolution in Whitehall. We have a unit, part of MI5, called the Joint Hostile States Task Force, but it doesn't do money. And they also don't do disinformation. And given the two main vectors of Russian influence in this country are money and disinformation, I think they're possibly missing a trick. So we need to have a really serious rethink and a lot of serious money, and also change the rules of the game a bit so that the other side can't do to government enforcement what they already do to journalists, which is outspend them and intimidate them. More questions, please. The gentleman there, stand up, please. No, sorry, the chap behind you, I'm afraid, sorry. He's got the microphone.
Sorry, Bill, in the context of the tragic death of your ex-colleague, a name I haven't heard very recently has been Stephen Curtis, who I had a sort of tangential contact with back in the 1990s. And that seemed to me to be an earlier extrajudicial killing of a UK lawyer who was quite well known in the UK. I know there's been a subsequent investigation by the UK authorities, but I haven't followed things too well. I just wonder if you could comment on Stephen Curtis's death.
For those who don't know, Stephen Curtis was about to give details to MI5 of the very dodgy Russians he'd been working for. Mysteriously, his helicopter blew up.
Well, sort of feeding into what you were saying, Ed, about financial intelligence, there's been, Stephen Curtis was one of many people who were killed or died under mysterious circumstances here in the UK, in which the UK law enforcement authorities have been subpar at investigating. And I don't know much about the Stephen Curtis case, but of course I agree with you that the circumstantial evidence is pretty extraordinary, that here's a guy who is managing the money and organizing the money laundering and of a bunch of Russian oligarchs, and was about to give information to the government, and his helicopter, I don't know if it blew up or just crashed on a perfect weather day with an experienced pilot. Obviously is very suspicious. I have my own interaction with UK law enforcement over another suspicious death. A man named Alexander Parapolichny came to us. He was an insider in the criminal group that stole the $230 million that Sergei was killed over. He had fallen out with his criminal co-conspirators. He was the guy in charge of the money laundering. They wanted to put him in jail in Moscow. He fled to the UK. He came to us with bank statements showing the money that went to Switzerland, which led to that whole story that I just shared with you earlier. He became a witness in the Swiss case, and he gave evidence to the Swiss prosecutor before the bad guy came on board. There was a good prosecutor for a year. And then the Swiss invited the husband of the tax official, to come and give his version of events. So he shows up, gives a different version, and then the Swiss, under their procedure, have something called a confrontation, where they have one witness confront another witness in a court setting. It's kind of interesting. And the confrontation was scheduled for December of 2012, and Alexander Parapolichny, who was living in St. George's Hill in Surrey, dropped dead while jogging outside his home in November of 2012, November 10th. I learned about it on the 16th of November, and I immediately called the police, and I said, it's the chief constable of the Surrey police, and I said, this man was a cooperating witness in a case against Russian organized crime. You should immediately open a murder investigation. And they ignored me and ignored me and ignored me for about 5 days. until I finally gave up and I went to the Independent and I told them the story and they put it on the front page, the Russian whistleblower killed in Surrey. And after the Independent, then there was the Daily Mail and the Times and the Telegraph, the Guardian, et cetera. And then about a week after that, the Surrey police opened an investigation. At this point, they had lost all, there was no crime scene. There was no, they had flushed all of his bodily fluids down the toilet. There was no, they lost all of his financial records. And they came to the conclusion there was nothing suspicious about his death. And then when it came for the coroner's inquest, and the insurance company was able to get like one last test tube of his stomach contents, and they found something called Gelsemium elegans in the stomach contents, which is it's known as heartbreak grass, which the Chinese use to kill people. And so at that point, then we were invited to be witnesses in the inquest. And it became a confrontation between me and the Surrey police, who were desperately trying to discredit me and trying to shut the whole thing down so they didn't have to admit that they failed completely in this investigation. And the coroner called it a natural death because there was no evidence of any sort, because the Surrey police had lost all the evidence to conclude otherwise. And so my own experience is that this country, and by the way, the person in charge of the Surrey police is now in charge of the National Crime Agency. Her name is Lynn Owens. And she was also the person who refused to open an investigation into the money laundering connected to the Magnitsky case.
And this was and it's been so shocking, the number of people who've died mysteriously in this country, that the Americans have got really cross about it and have leaked to my colleague Heidi Blake their take on some of these things, and she produced a book about it, and I've then investigated a bit myself, and I'm absolutely scandalized that the police they never went. He'd come back from a trip to Paris, peripolitically, where he'd been lured by a very mysterious woman about who I better not say anything because her lawyers might be watching, and the Surrey police never went to Paris to find out whether the place he'd been 6 hours before he dropped dead, because he came back on the Eurostar, went for a jog and fell over, might have possibly had something to do with his untimely end. So it's a stunning tale of incompetence. It happens in other countries too. There was a man in the United States who was about to talk to the FBI and managed to beat himself to death with a baseball bat, which I've never tried myself, but I think might be quite difficult. But I think Britain is sort of murder central for the Russians at the moment. Let's have some cheerful questions. Yes, the gentleman there was very patient, and yeah, go ahead.
How do you explain the paradox between Boris Johnson seeming to be very active militarily and the backdrop of all the things that you say?
Guilty conscience.
Bill? I don't know. I think that I think he's just a happy-go-lucky guy, and he got serious when he saw how serious. I think I actually have a lot of good things to say about Boris Johnson and how he's handling this thing. I mean, if you look at the, he was up front providing weapons when almost nobody was providing weapons. We had to fly around Germany because they wouldn't let us fly over Germany to provide weapons to Ukraine. I mean, we were providing offensive weapons to Ukrainians when the Germans weren't even allowing us to fly over their airspace. And then when they finally decided to supply weapons, it was 5,000 helmets. And if you look at the sanctions list now, compared to the US sanctions list, it's quite extraordinary how many high-value targets we have that the US doesn't have. Forbes has published a sort of update of who's sanctioning who among the billionaires, and it's really, I think we've done a pretty good job. And yeah, this Lord Lebedev thing doesn't look good for Boris, but maybe they were just pals. But I think more or less, he's really risen to the occasion, and I praise him for what he's doing, and I think the Ukrainians do too.
I'd also say that I think the British military and the British civil service and British intelligence has played a really important role in this and have provided him with a lot of well worked out good options, and he's been given decisions to make which were good decisions, which were worked out by the officials, and all credit to him for that. And I think that the combination of, it's very, I don't know if anyone here some Isha, but we're very lucky that Dominic Raab is not Foreign Secretary anymore. And perhaps he won't be MP for Isha anymore quite soon, because we're working on that one too. But I do think that there's a fundamental problem in the Conservative Party, which is money. And they have taken money from some people who, how do we say this, non-libelous way, whose careers have been dogged by controversy. That's not libelous. Both Russians whose careers have been dogged by controversy and Chinese who's dogged by controversy and amazing good fortune as well. People have become amazingly rich very quickly, which is obviously wonderful. And
when you become a member of parliament, you have parliameantary privilege and you can say everything. So if nothing else, we should elect him so that he can just say whatever he wants to say without worrying about libel.
Yes, well, I mean, parliamentary privilege is actually really useful. You can say things to a committee, and I have said things to even to public committees, which you can't be sued about. But I think that there's a real problem with party finance in this country. For the Lib Dems, it's a very different problem. We just don't have any money. For them, it's a problem that they have money from some people who are trying to buy political influence and buy knighthoods and buy peerages and buy respectability. And we don't just launder reputations, money in this country, we launder reputations. And I'm afraid that the Conservative Party is part of that. Let's have some more. There's lots of good. Lady here in the front has been very patient.
I have two questions, so one for each of you. Unexplained wealth orders to Ed, and also transparency on properties, especially since I live not very far from this lovely enclave in Surrey. And to Bill, I just wanted to ask if we could frame it not as an either or, but as an and. So you mentioned that it's not about getting rid of Ukraine or Ukrainian state per se, that this is a war that Putin needs to have. And I think you're correct, but I also think that the Russians have been at Ukraine destruction well since 1720s, when they decided not to be Muscovy but become Russia, so they could have our history. So I was just wondering if you could add that onto your narrative. Thank you.
The unexplained wealth order is a great idea, but we use them only against the softest possible targets and very sparingly. So I think the showcase example is the estranged wife of a disgraced Azeri banker. So she has quite a lot on her plate. Her husband's not defending her, her country's not defending her, and her country's not one of the ones that we bend over backwards to be nice to. So, or at least relative to some of the others. So I think that the UWOs are a nice idea, but they were meant to be a game changer, and they're absolutely not. I think that that we have an enormous scandal in this country about our commercial registry. In the time that you've all been watching and listening to this, you could have been on your phones also registering companies at Companies House, and you could have registered a company in the name called Bill Browder Enterprises, another one called Edward Lucas Enterprises. You could register yourself as the director of Mickey Mouse, or indeed registered in a real name, no one would know. And you could then take that company registration, and perhaps not in Britain but elsewhere, open a bank account with it, and then you'd be off to the races. And this is a huge scandal. When I was investigating Anna Chapman's the famous Russian spy in her activities here, I found that she had stolen the identity of a Kent electrician called Stephen Sugden. His date of birth, his signature, his details were on a company which was doing something to do with money laundering or some other intelligence thing she was doing. We never really found out. And his name is still there at Companies House. And I went to Companies House and said, can't you change it? And they said, we don't check the information, we just record it. I went to the police and they said it wasn't clear that any crime being committed. And I went to the people in raincoats and they said, our job is to catch spies, not criminals. And that was the end, and it's still there. You can Google it right now, just look at Southern Union, that's the name of the company. So this is a huge problem. And I've done a campaign video actually outside Companies House on this, and which is in the heart of the constituency. And one of the things that happens as a result of this, these phony companies, is that you start using them to buy property. They own a company in BVI, the one in BVI owned a company in Panama, the one in Panama owns something somewhere else. And then it turns up and one of our ever obliging and deeply honourable estate agents says, yeah, that's absolutely fine, don't worry where the money comes from, and they can then buy a mansion in this constituency and probably build a basement swimming pool as well, not annoying everybody else in the road, which is a good local campaigning issue of the kind that we like. So it's astonishing to me. We've talked about this for years, and and the economic crime bill, which the government has talked about ad nauseam, still hasn't got to grips with this with this issue of company registration and the trust and company service providers and the Scottish limited partnerships, and I could bore on all evening about this, but it's like having the Maginot Line with a huge hole in the middle, and the oligarchs and the kleptocrats and everybody else just canters straight through it. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to take a bunch of questions. There's someone at the back whose hand's been up a lot. Stand up so we can see you. Lady at the very back, yes. And we'll take another couple, and then we'll come back and wind up.
You mentioned, and Fiona Hill did as well, that one of the reasons why Putin was emboldened to act as he did in February is that we, both the UK and the US and others, didn't respond appropriately to all their other incursions over the last 20 years, including Salisbury, et cetera. So what could we have done in the past that we didn't do? And are we getting it right now? And you clearly have emphasized sanctions as being an important tool, but is there something else that we should have done before that we didn't? And are we getting it right? Or what else should we be doing now?
Right, let's take a couple more short ones. Let's see. Mr. Sheridan at the very front, a deference to. This is, if you read the Sunday Times, you'll have read Michael Sheridan's articles, and particularly you must read his book on Hong Kong. It's brilliant.
Oh, thanks. I'll move swiftly on. Are sanctions principally to punish, or are they to deter? Because what you have outlined to us, which I find quite shocking, is the sheer ineptitude and inefficiency of those who are supposed to assemble the targets. So if it's been this bad about Russia, what prospect is there of using sanctions as an instrument to deter other ill-doers elsewhere?
Right, that's a good one. Let's have another, one of our key activists here, middle white shirt. Yeah, great, go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, Bill, actually from the perspective of an investor rather than as an activist for once. The fall of the Soviet Union produced the business culture both of Russia and Kazakhstan, as you talked about, but also of Estonia and countries like that. And the question that I wanted to ask is, what do you think has been the key differentiator between those two? And do you think there's any hope left for other former members of the Soviet Union to become a more Western-style investment environment in the way that the Baltics have?
Bill, do you want to do that one first?
Sure. I think on one hand, Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia have become, proper European countries. On the other hand, they haven't. Estonia was the main thoroughfare for all dirty money that came out of Russia. Danske Bank, the Estonian branch of Danske Bank, laundered $230 billion over a 10-year period. And the Estonian authorities just allowed it to happen. And in fact, there's a famous central banker named Kozlov who even went to Estonia to try to stop it at the very beginning. He was an honest Russian central banker, and he visited the Estonians, tried to stop it. They ignored him, and then he was killed in Moscow by the people who were doing the money laundering. And so Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania are now stepping up to the plate and behaving like proper citizens when it comes to financial regulation. But what it comes down to, I think, is Western pressure. So these countries joined the European Union and did what they had to do, and it became good places, better places because they did. And when they were outed for doing stuff that they continued to do, which was very Soviet, then they got into a lot of trouble, and they decided that they don't want to be put on blacklists, and so they behave themselves. I think Ukraine has a huge opportunity here. If Ukraine were to join the European Union, it really would be, in 20 years from now, it would be, like Poland. And I really think that these, creating these standards creates a real good scenario, and that's the main differentiation between Kazakhstan and Russia and Estonia and so on, is the fact that they joined the European Union.
Christopher, you want to say something?
It's a separate question, actually, Bill. I was wondering if you're still in touch with your peer group investors from back then at the present day, who's Americans and others who stayed invested in Russia, and what you say to them and vice versa.
Well, a lot of people call me up and said, "Hey, what should we buy it now? Buy on the dip." And I said, there's two good reasons not to buy it. One is moral, and I mentioned this before, which is doing business in Russia is like doing business and buying shares of companies in Nazi Germany. But the second is just self-interest. That if Putin is ready to tear up the rule book on borders and sovereignty and murder, why in the world would he respect corporate governance and debt obligations and things like that? I mean, I think all this stuff is going to get renationalized. It would be why allow 40% of Lukoil to be held by anybody other than him? It doesn't make any sense. And so I think there's a very high probability that these things literally go to zero. I mean, a lot of they're trading right now suspended and they're sort of at zero, but they literally go to zero because he takes them away.
And if anyone watches Russian television, I think it was the Solovyov program a couple of days ago, they were saying we need a new Lavrenti Beria to run the economy, which is quite astonishing. But I want to just finish up with those two excellent questions. One about, do sanctions deter or punish? I mean, if you believe that they will punish, then they also deter. And I think the problem is at the moment they don't really do either. They don't really punish and they don't really deter. But we're getting there. I think that Bill's Magnitsky sanctions are incredibly effective because they're so personal. And people sit in a room and they think, this guy can't go to the West anymore and his assets are frozen. And if I do what he did, that might happen to me. So I think we're beginning to get there. And I think these highly personalized approach is where you put the responsibility on the individual decision maker are more effective than the sort of sectoral sanctions that we've tended to do in the past.
Let me just say one thing about this China thing, which is that these sanctions both punish and deter. They're not deterring Putin. Once he made his decision to go into Ukraine, he's already made his decision. He's not going to back down. But I think they have deterred China from going into Taiwan in a military. And they might do some, Chinese version, the slow boil frog boiling slowly type of thing that they always do. But they're not going to send their aircraft carriers into Taiwan. I mean, I think the Chinese have watched this very carefully and said, God Almighty, for the love of God, thank God it wasn't us. And I think that it's a huge deterrent. And I think the whole world has woken up. All bad guys everywhere have woken up to the idea. For so long Obama said red line of chemical weapons in Syria. We didn't do anything. And so every bad guy in the world says, okay, well, America's not going to do anything. And then after we withdrew from Afghanistan and let it fall to the Taliban, that was even more of an encouragement. And now all of a sudden, 6 months after we've withdrawn from Afghanistan, we actually do something. And I think everybody is taking notice, and nobody wants to be in the same position that Putin's in. And so I think that there's huge deterrent value on a broad scale for what we've done.
And I think that's a hugely important point, that what's happening now is a kind of dress rehearsal for a slightly different possible confrontation with China. And if we get this right, it's much less likely we have the confrontation and much less likely that we lose. If we get this wrong, it's much more likely that something bad happens and much more likely that it ends badly for us. The narrative that the West is finished was very deeply rooted until about February the 23rd. And particularly if you read Chinese or Russian press, it was full of stuff about how America's in decline, Biden's senile, the EU's falling apart, blah, blah, blah. And all that's changed. That's very hard to argue now. So amidst everything else, I think that one could say the enormous sacrifice of the Ukrainians has given the West its mojo back in a way that may have long-term significance. But I just want to finish on this brilliant question from the back, because I think we were warned back in the 90s, actually. If you look at, just Google Lennart Meri, Hamburg, 1994, and there's a speech by the then Estonian president, Lennart Meri, warning right back then in the supposedly benign Yeltsin era about the danger we faced from this neo-imperialist, resurgent neo-imperialism in Russia, and something that was completely forgotten now, the Karaganov Doctrine, which said that Russia has the right and indeed the duty to intervene in other countries on behalf of what were called Russian speakers, which is a term unknown in international law, whether those Russian speakers liked it or not. And it really repays reading, because we were warned, and I was in the room when Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and others would say to Western officials, watch out, we are already having problems here in the Baltic states with dirty money, with propaganda, with subversion, with the use of energy as a weapon. We're small, Russia can do it, Russia's weak at the moment, but Russia's on the way back and it'll be happening to you too sooner or later, so please deal with it now. And those people weren't just ignored, they were patronized and belittled and told, you don't really understand Russia the way we do in Brussels and Berlin and Washington and London and so on. And those people have been vindicated, and the Ukrainians have been vindicated, and that's why I think it's particularly important now that we adopt the rather un-Western approach of having a bit of humility, because if they were right then, they're probably right now, and we should be listening to them. There were so many missed opportunities in the past. There were so many times when Russia was still weak, when we could have said, this is absolutely out of order, don't even think about it. At times when we were still financing Russia, when Russia was an economic basket case. And we missed those opportunities again and again and again. And the result of that is that tens of thousands of people are dead and millions of people have had their lives shattered. And that is actually largely, it's obviously Putin's fault for the war, but it's also our fault. And we really need to take that seriously, and perhaps not a moment too soon to take it on board. So there's one very pleasant thing I have to do, which is to say that we have someone here who has decided to celebrate her birthday by coming to this event. Now, obviously, Lib Dem events are always wonderful, and this one's particularly wonderful. But to spend your 90th birthday coming to this is absolutely fantastic. So Sheila, don't stand up. You're sitting over there. But can I say, having chatted to you beforehand, I want to be like you when I'm 90. And thank you so much for coming, and happy birthday.